She strayed from the path because of something trivial that others would not have noticed. What she found, far from the trail, should not have survived to this day. One house, one decision, and consequences that were kept secret for years. Subscribe to the channel and write in the comments which city you are watching from. The day had begun without any sense of exception. It was one of those rare mountain mornings that felt deliberately calm, as if the landscape itself had decided to offer no resistance. The air was warm but not heavy, clear enough that distant ridgelines appeared sharpened rather than softened by haze. The sky carried a pale, steady blue, unbroken by clouds, and the sun rose without drama, spreading light evenly across the slopes. She noticed this calm almost immediately, not because she expected otherwise, but because she had learned over the years to register such details. At 42, she had grown accustomed to reading her surroundings with the same attentiveness she applied to documents, terrain surveys, or long-neglected archives. Her name was Eleanor Ward, and she had never considered herself adventurous. What brought her into the mountains was not a hunger for risk, but a habit of thoroughness, a tendency to follow things to their end. The trip itself had been planned weeks earlier. On paper, it was simple. She had been contracted to assist with a regional environmental assessment tied to a proposed expansion of protected land. Her role was narrow and technical, verifying historical land use, records against physical remnants in the field. Old routes, abandoned structures, markers that no longer appeared on modern maps. The work suited her. It required patience rather than boldness, attention rather than imagination. She had arrived the previous evening, spent the night in a modest lodge at the edge of the range, and set out early, carrying only what she needed. Her pack was light but carefully arranged: water, notes, a folded map annotated with pencil marks, a compact camera, a notebook worn soft at the edges. She moved at a steady pace, unhurried, not because she was confident, but because she had learned that haste distorted observation. The trail she followed was well established, though not crowded. It wound upward through open stretches of alpine grass, interrupted by clusters of stone and scrub that suggested older paths branching away, now mostly reclaimed by time. Eleanor kept to the marked route, noting occasional deviations in her notebook, small details that might matter later. A line of stones arranged too deliberately to be natural, a flattened section of earth where something heavy had once rested. The warmth surprised her slightly. At this elevation, even summer days often carried a sharpness that lingered beneath the surface. But today, the air was generous, almost forgiving. The ground beneath her boots was dry, firm, reliable. There was no immediate sense of exposure, no whisper of danger. It was precisely the sort of day that encouraged confidence, even complacency, though Eleanor was careful not to indulge either. She walked for several hours, stopping only briefly to drink and to sketch a rough outline of the surrounding slopes. Her focus was steady, her thoughts aligned with the task at hand. She was not thinking about her life beyond the mountains, not about the apartment she had left behind, or the quiet absence that had settled there over the past year. She had learned to compartmentalize, to allow work to occupy the space where reflection might otherwise intrude. It was near midday when she noticed the first sign that did not fit. At first, it was nothing more than a slight irregularity in the landscape, a shape that interrupted the slope at an angle too deliberate to be geological. She almost dismissed it, attributing the impression to shadow or perspective. The sun, though high, cast long enough lines across the uneven ground to deceive the eye. She continued walking, following the trail as it curved gently to the left. The shape lingered at the edge of her vision, persistent without being insistent. She slowed, then stopped altogether, turning back a few steps to adjust her vantage point. From where she stood, the anomaly became clearer, though still indistinct. It was not large. If it had been any other color, any other texture, it might have blended entirely into the slope. But something about its surface absorbed light differently. It did not reflect, did not glint, did not break into highlights the way stone or bare wood would have done. She checked her map. There was no notation in that area, no structure marked, no ruin, no historical reference that she could recall. The land designation in that section was vague, a blank stretch indicating little more than elevation and contour lines. Eleanor hesitated. Deviating from the planned route was not something she did casually, but neither was ignoring something that clearly warranted attention. The detour would be short, she reasoned, a matter of minutes, enough to confirm whether the shape was natural or artificial. She left the trail deliberately, marking the point of departure with a glance and a mental note. The ground sloped upward more steeply in this direction, though the footing remained stable. Low grasses brushed against her boots, and small stones shifted beneath her weight. But there was no real difficulty. The warmth of the day persisted, unbroken, and the silence was complete, save for the sound of her own movement. As she drew closer, the shape resolved itself into something unmistakably constructed. It was a building. Not a ruin in the conventional sense, not a scatter of collapsed beams or stones reclaimed by moss. It stood intact, compact, its outline clear against the slope. The structure was small, no more than a single-room dwelling by her estimation, set low to the ground, as if intentionally minimizing its presence. The roof slanted slightly backward, following the natural angle of the hillside, and extended beyond the walls in a generous overhang. What stopped her, what made her remain still for several long seconds, was not the existence of the building itself, but its surface. The walls were not bare wood, they were covered. At first, her mind resisted the conclusion. She searched for alternative explanations. Bark, perhaps. Some form of thatching adapted to vertical use. But as she stepped closer, the truth asserted itself with quiet certainty. The exterior was layered with animal skin and fur. The material was arranged in overlapping sections, each piece secured in a way that suggested intention rather than improvisation. The fur varied in color and texture. Some sections were darker, others pale and sun-faded. The direction of the layering followed a consistent pattern, angled downward to shed water, much like shingles. Eleanor felt a brief, involuntary tightening in her chest. Not fear, exactly. Something closer to disbelief. This was not decorative. There was no attempt to make it appear symbolic or ceremonial. The skins were worn, practical, their edges softened by time and exposure. They bore marks of use, not of display. She moved closer still. Slow now, her earlier momentum replaced by caution. The building did not smell of decay. There was no overpowering odor of rot or neglect. The air around it was neutral, carrying only the faint, dry scent of the surrounding grass and stone. She reached out, then stopped herself. The impulse to touch was strong, but she restrained it. Observation first, she reminded herself. The structure was set on a foundation of stone, not mortared, but carefully balanced. The stones were arranged to elevate the wooden base just enough to allow air to pass beneath, preventing moisture from collecting. The entrance was low, deliberately so, requiring anyone who entered to bend forward. There were no visible windows from this side, only narrow recesses near the roofline that might admit light without exposing the interior. Eleanor walked slowly around the building, her steps measured, her attention acute. From each angle, the house revealed more of its logic. The skins were not randomly chosen. They varied in thickness, heavier where the wind would strike hardest, lighter where protection was less critical. In places, newer pieces had been added over older ones, indicating maintenance rather than abandonment. This realization unsettled her more than the materials themselves. Someone had tended this place not long ago. She checked for signs of recent use, footprints, disturbed ground, anything that might suggest occupancy. The soil around the structure was compacted, but not fresh. Grass grew close to the walls, untrampled. There was no clear path leading to the door. The building existed as if intentionally removed from circulation. Eleanor stepped back, taking in the structure as a whole. Against the bright clarity of the day, it seemed almost to withdraw, absorbing light, reducing contrast. From a distance, she realized it would be easy to miss. The muted tones of fur and hide blended seamlessly with the mountain's palette. She stood there longer than she had intended, aware that time was passing, that her planned route awaited her return. Yet she felt no urgency to leave. The building exerted a quiet pull, not through mystery, but through coherence. It made sense in a way she had not expected. There was no sign posted, no marker, no explanation offered. The house did not announce itself. It simply existed. Eleanor adjusted her pack, drew a steady breath, and approached the entrance. She did not yet reach for the door. Instead, she paused, allowing herself one final moment of consideration. This was not part of her assignment, but it was now undeniably part of her day. And though the warmth of the sun remained unchanged, she felt, for the first time since morning, that she had crossed an invisible boundary, leaving behind a landscape that asked nothing of her, and stepping into one that quietly demanded attention. Eleanor did not enter the house immediately. The decision to step inside felt premature, as though doing so would collapse a careful sequence that had not yet fully unfolded. Instead, she remained outside, allowing her understanding of the structure to deepen through distance and movement rather than intrusion. She began to circle it slowly, keeping a measured pace, attentive to how the building revealed itself from different angles. From the uphill side, the house appeared almost pressed into the slope, as if the mountain itself had accepted its presence and leaned forward to shield it. The rear wall was partially embraced by stone, not buried, but supported, the way older structures sometimes were, relying on the weight and stability of the land rather than resisting it. The roof extended farther on this side, its edge thick and deliberate, casting a narrow band of shadow along the upper wall. Eleanor noticed how the overhang aligned with the prevailing wind direction indicated on her map. This was not coincidence. Someone had understood this place intimately. She continued her circuit, stepping carefully over uneven ground. From the eastern side, the texture of the exterior became more apparent. The skins were arranged in horizontal layers, each overlapping the one beneath it. The fur lay flat, smoothed by time and weather, its natural sheen dulled into something matte and understated. In places, the ends of the hides were folded inward, secured with what appeared to be narrow leather ties rather than nails. She crouched slightly to examine one of these fastenings more closely. The leather had darkened with age, but remained flexible, not cracked or brittle. It had been treated, she realized, preserved with knowledge rather than guesswork. The thought unsettled her again. This was not an experiment abandoned after failure. It was a method sustained over time. She straightened and moved on, noting subtle variations in the material. Some sections bore longer, coarser fur, likely from animals adapted to colder elevations. Others were shorter, denser, more compact. The arrangement followed no aesthetic pattern, yet it was far from random. The heavier hides faced outward toward the most exposed directions, while the thinner ones occupied sheltered stretches beneath the roofline. Eleanor paused, stepping back to view the house as a whole. Its proportions were modest, but the construction conveyed a sense of completeness. It did not feel temporary. There was no sense that it was waiting to be replaced by something more permanent. It had been built to last, but not to dominate. She thought of the many abandoned cabins she had encountered over the years. Structures thrown together quickly, relying on readily available lumber, left to warp and split under relentless weather. Those buildings often bore the marks of urgency or desperation. This one did not. Its presence was calm, deliberate, almost restrained. As she reached the downhill side, the landscape opened up, offering a view across a wide expanse of alpine terrain. From here, the house nearly vanished. The colors of the hides mirrored the muted tones of stone and dry grass. The irregular surface absorbed light rather than reflecting it, breaking up the outline of the walls. Eleanor realized that even from a short distance, the building would be difficult to distinguish unless one knew exactly where to look. She felt a brief chill that had nothing to do with temperature. The idea that something so carefully constructed could remain unseen, not through concealment, but through harmony, challenged her assumptions. The house was not hidden. It simply did not announce itself. She completed the circle, returning to the front. The entrance faced slightly away from the main slope, angled to reduce direct exposure. The door itself was solid wood, weathered, but intact, framed by a narrow recess that created a shallow vestibule. Above it, the skins were layered more densely, forming an additional barrier against wind and rain. Eleanor stood there, absorbing the cumulative impression. The structure resisted simple categorization. It was not a relic of some distant past, nor did it align with modern survivalist aesthetics she had seen in other remote dwellings. There were no solar panels, no visible metal reinforcements, no signs of contemporary adaptation layered awkwardly onto older forms. Everything here belonged to a single coherent logic. She became aware of her own breathing, steady but slightly slower now, as if her body had adjusted to a different rhythm. The quiet around her felt intentional, not merely the absence of sound, but a presence in itself. Even the wind seemed to move differently near the house, its force broken and softened by the textured exterior. Eleanor took out her notebook and began to write, her pencil moving in longer strokes than usual. She described the materials, the orientation, the layering. She noted her hypotheses, careful to distinguish observation from inference. The act of writing grounded her, gave her something to hold on to as her curiosity deepened. She wondered about the builder. The question arose naturally, without drama. Who would choose this? Who would invest the time and effort required to source, prepare, and maintain such materials in this location? It was not the sort of work undertaken lightly or impulsively. The learning curve alone would have been steep. Her thoughts turned briefly to history. She had read about traditional shelters in northern regions, about the use of hides and furs for insulation long before modern materials existed. But those structures were often temporary or seasonal, designed to be dismantled and moved. This house was fixed. It had roots, metaphorical if not literal. The realization sharpened her focus. This was not an imitation of tradition. It was an adaptation. Eleanor moved closer to the wall again, this time allowing herself to touch it. The fur beneath her fingers was dry, resilient, warmer than she expected. It did not crumble or shed. Instead, it yielded slightly, then returned to form. Beneath it, she could feel the firmness of the wooden planks, separated by a thin cushion of air. She withdrew her hand slowly, conscious of the intimacy of the gesture. Touching the house felt like crossing another threshold, smaller but significant. It confirmed what her eyes had already suggested. The exterior was not symbolic. It was functional. She stepped back once more, her gaze tracing the line where roof met wall. There were no gutters, no visible channels for water runoff, yet the slope and overhang worked together to direct moisture away. The skins themselves bore faint discolorations that suggested rain had passed over them many times without saturating the structure beneath. Eleanor felt a growing sense of respect, tempered by unease. The house did not fit neatly into her understanding of land use, nor into the bureaucratic frameworks she worked within. It existed outside those systems, not in opposition, but in quiet parallel. The absence of obvious decay troubled her most. In this environment, neglect announced itself quickly. Wood warped, roofs sagged, foundations shifted. Here, there was none of that. Everything was settled, balanced, maintained. Even the stone base showed signs of occasional adjustment, smaller rocks wedged carefully to compensate for subtle movement. Someone had returned here repeatedly. Someone had cared. She looked again for signs of recent activity. There were none that she could confidently identify. No fresh tracks, no disturbed vegetation, no smoke residue near the roofline. The house was dormant, but not abandoned in the usual sense. Eleanor checked the time. She had already spent longer here than she had planned. The rational part of her mind urged her to move on, to note the location and return later with proper authorization if necessary. Yet another part, quieter but insistent, resisted the idea of leaving without understanding more. The warmth of the day persisted, unchanged, but it now felt almost irrelevant. The house had introduced a different kind of climate, one governed by intention rather than weather. She stood at the entrance once more, her hand hovering near the door. She did not touch it yet. Instead, she rested her palm briefly against the fur-covered wall beside it, feeling the steady presence beneath the surface. Whatever lay inside, she sensed, would not contradict what she had already seen. It would not be chaos or eccentricity. It would follow the same careful logic, the same restraint. Eleanor took a breath, steady and deliberate, and shifted her weight forward. The world she had been walking through all morning, the clear air, the open trail, the uncomplicated purpose of her task receded slightly, not disappearing, but making room. The house remained silent, patient. And for the first time since she had left the marked path, Eleanor understood that she was no longer merely observing something that existed apart from her. She was approaching a place shaped by choice, and whatever she found beyond the door would demand one of her in return. Eleanor rested her hand on the door, longer than she had intended. The wood beneath her palm was rough, unpolished, carrying the faint warmth of the day. It did not feel fragile. Whatever age the house carried was not the kind that weakened it. She stood there, aware of the stillness around her, of the way the mountains seemed to pause rather than watch. Entering was no longer a question of curiosity alone. It felt like a choice with weight, small in scale but deliberate in consequence. She pushed the door inward slowly. The movement was quiet. There was no creak, no protest from hinges. The door swung with a resistance that felt intentional, as if designed to close firmly against wind rather than open easily to visitors. Eleanor had to lean forward slightly to step through the low opening, lowering her head, adjusting her posture. The act was subtle, but unmistakable. She crossed the threshold, not upright and assured, but bent, momentarily diminished by the space she was entering. The light changed immediately. Outside, the brightness had been even and generous. Inside, the illumination softened, diffused through narrow openings she could not yet fully see. The contrast was not jarring. Instead, it felt like the gradual dimming of a room at evening, a controlled transition rather than an abrupt loss. Her eyes adjusted quickly. The temperature surprised her. Despite the warmth of the day, the interior was cool, but not cold, steady and balanced. The air did not feel trapped or stale. It moved gently, circulating without drafts, carrying no sharp odors. There was the faintest scent of smoke, old and ingrained, not recent enough to sting the nose, but present enough to suggest long familiarity with fire. Eleanor straightened carefully, taking in the space. The room was larger than she had expected, not in physical dimensions, but in how it used them. The ceiling was low but not oppressive, following the slope of the roof in a way that created a sense of enclosure without confinement. The walls were lined with wood, darkened not by neglect, but by time and use. The grain was visible beneath layers of wear, smooth where hands had passed over it repeatedly, rougher in corners, where touch was unnecessary. She closed the door behind her, gently, aware of the finality of the sound as it settled into place. The interior grew quieter still, the muted noises of the outside world falling away. Even her breathing sounded different, absorbed rather than echoed. There was no immediate sign of disorder, no clutter, no scattered objects suggesting haste or abandonment. Everything inside seemed to have a place, and to remain there by choice rather than habit. A simple wooden table stood near the center of the room, its surface worn but clean. One chair rested beside it, pushed in, aligned. Against one wall, a narrow bed was built into the structure itself, raised slightly from the floor, covered with layered blankets folded with care. Eleanor moved slowly, her steps light, conscious of the way sound traveled here. The floorboards did not creak. They gave beneath her weight just enough to register movement, then held steady. She noticed the construction immediately. The boards were not uniform, but fitted together with precision, their edges shaped to meet despite differences in width and grain. Her eyes followed the walls upward, noting the small openings near the roofline. They were positioned strategically, allowing light to enter without creating direct lines of sight from outside. Each opening was deep, tunnel-like, the wood thick around it, reinforcing the sense that the house was built to receive the world selectively. She approached one of these openings and peered out. The view was narrow, framed tightly by the wall. From this angle, the mountain appeared abstracted, reduced to texture and movement. Eleanor understood then that the house was not designed to offer vistas. It did not invite the occupant to look outward expansively. It encouraged focus inward. She returned her attention to the room. Along one wall, shelves had been carved directly into the structure. They held a modest collection of objects: a metal cup dulled by use, a ceramic bowl with a hairline crack carefully sealed, a small assortment of tools arranged in a deliberate order. There was no excess. Nothing here appeared to be kept for sentiment alone. Each item bore signs of having earned its place. Eleanor's gaze lingered on a compact stove set into a stone base near the far corner. The stones were blackened, their surfaces smoothed by heat and time. Above it, a narrow chimney disappeared into the ceiling, its edges sealed carefully. She looked for signs of recent use, but there were none she could clearly identify. The ash within was old, compacted, undisturbed. The absence of recent activity was striking, but it did not feel like abandonment. The room held a quality she struggled to name. It was not waiting, exactly. It was complete. She became aware of a low, almost imperceptible hum, not a sound, but a sensation, as though the house itself maintained a steady internal balance. The walls insulated not only against temperature, but against intrusion, noise, distraction. Eleanor felt herself slowing, her thoughts stretching out, no longer pulled forward by urgency. She moved toward the table and rested her hand on its surface. The wood was warm now, having absorbed heat from the room. She traced a shallow groove near one corner, the mark of repeated use, perhaps where someone had drawn diagrams or written notes. The idea did not feel fanciful. It felt likely. Her attention was drawn to a stack of notebooks placed neatly at the far end of the table. They were unassuming, bound simply, their covers worn but intact. Eleanor hesitated before touching them, aware that this would be a different kind of intrusion. Observing the structure had felt like study. Reading someone's words would be something else entirely. She left the notebooks for the moment and continued to survey the space. There were no personal decorations in the conventional sense, no photographs, no carved symbols, no attempts to soften the space with ornament. Yet the room did not feel impersonal. The care evident in its construction and maintenance carried a different kind of intimacy, one rooted in attention rather than display. Eleanor noticed a series of small hooks along one wall, some empty, others holding items of clothing. The garments were simple, sturdy, made from natural fibers. They were clean, folded with care where appropriate. Nothing here suggested a sudden departure. There was no sign of panic, no unfinished task left suspended. She felt a subtle shift within herself, a recalibration of expectation. She had not consciously anticipated chaos, but some part of her had been prepared for it. Instead, she found order, not imposed, but lived into existence. The silence deepened as she stood there, absorbing the room. It was not oppressive. It did not press against her. It allowed space for thought, for observation, for the kind of attention she rarely afforded herself outside of work. Eleanor became aware then of her own presence in the room, of the way her body occupied space that had clearly been designed with a single inhabitant in mind. The house was efficient, but not cramped. It did not feel as though it rejected additional occupants. Rather, it had been calibrated for one. She returned her gaze to the notebooks. Approaching them felt inevitable now. They were part of the room's logic, as integral as the walls or the stove. She reached out, lifting the top one carefully. It had weight, more than she expected, its pages thick, filled. The handwriting on the first page was neat, precise, immediately recognizable as modern. Eleanor closed the notebook again without reading further. The realization settled slowly, but with clarity. Whoever had built this house was not a relic of some distant past, nor a romanticized figure escaping civilization in a haze of nostalgia. This was someone who had lived in the same world she did, who had made a conscious decision to step aside from it, carrying knowledge forward rather than abandoning it. She set the notebook back in its place and stepped away from the table. The house did not confront her with answers. It offered coherence. Everything she had seen, from the layered skins outside to the careful arrangement within, pointed toward intention rather than eccentricity. The space asked to be understood on its own terms. Eleanor leaned lightly against the wall, feeling the muted solidity beneath the fur-lined exterior. The mountain beyond was still there, unchanged, but it felt distant now, less immediate than the interior of this small, deliberate world. She realized, with a quiet certainty, that stepping inside had altered the nature of her presence here. She was no longer merely a passerby who had noticed something unusual. She had crossed into a space shaped by choice and sustained by discipline. And whatever story lay ahead, it would not announce itself suddenly. It would unfold as this place had been built, layer by layer, demanding patience, and something more difficult still, respect. Leonore did not open the notebooks immediately. After setting the first one back on the table, she stepped away, giving herself distance, as though proximity alone might hurry her into conclusions she was not ready to form. The room seemed to accept this pause without impatience. Nothing here demanded attention. It simply remained. She moved instead toward the shelves carved into the wall, letting her gaze travel slowly from object to object. A small hand plane rested beside a bundle of sharpened pencils. A length of cord, coiled with care, showed signs of repeated use, its fibers smoothed by friction. A folded map lay beneath a thin stone, the edges frayed, the surface marked with faint pencil lines that did not match any modern grid. These were not keepsakes. They were tools that had been returned to their places after use, not abandoned. The more she looked, the clearer it became that the house had not been arranged all at once. It had evolved. Objects had been added, repositioned, sometimes removed entirely. The space bore the subtle marks of revision, of a mind that observed its own habits and adjusted accordingly. Eleanor recognized this instinct immediately. It was the same impulse that drove her to annotate documents, to revisit conclusions, to refine rather than accumulate. She picked up the map carefully. The paper was thick, older than the notebooks, its surface softened by handling. The markings were sparse but deliberate. Lines traced ridges, water sources, paths that did not appear on any official chart she had used. In the margins, small notes had been added over time, written in the same precise hand she had glimpsed in the notebook. The handwriting had not changed dramatically. It remained steady, disciplined, unmistakably contemporary. Eleanor replaced the map and returned to the table. This time, she opened the top notebook. The first page contained no introduction, no dramatic declaration. It began simply, with a date and a brief observation about weather conditions. The language was direct, unembellished. She read a few lines, then another page, then another, her initial caution giving way to focused attention. The entries were not a diary in the traditional sense. They did not dwell on emotion or personal history. Instead, they recorded processes, measurements, reflections on materials and methods, notes on how different hides responded to prolonged exposure, observations about wind patterns shifting with seasonal changes, adjustments made to the structure to improve airflow without sacrificing insulation. Eleanor felt a subtle recalibration of her assumptions. This was not a man retreating into the past. This was someone testing, refining, applying inherited knowledge within a present context. She continued reading, her pace unhurried. Gradually, references to ancestry began to appear. Not romanticized accounts, but practical recollections. Mentions of a great-grandfather who had built winter shelters using similar techniques, not out of tradition for its own sake, but because those methods had worked. Notes on how certain practices had been lost over time, not because they failed, but because they had been rendered inconvenient by abundance. Eleanor paused, letting that thought settle. The man who had written these notes did not speak of his predecessors with reverence alone. He treated them as sources of data, as earlier iterations of problem-solving. Tradition, in his hands, was not a static inheritance. It was a set of principles subject to scrutiny. She turned another page. There were entries that placed him firmly in the modern world, references to materials he had rejected after testing, brief mentions of regulatory frameworks he found incompatible with the scale and intent of his project. Occasional notes on visitors who had come close without realizing it, hikers who had passed within sight of the house without noticing its presence. Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest at that. The idea that she might have done the same, that she might have walked past without seeing, unsettled her. It underscored how easily coherence could be overlooked when it did not announce itself. She read on. The notebooks revealed a man methodical in his thinking, disciplined in his habits. He documented failures as carefully as successes. When a section of hide had degraded more quickly than expected, he noted it without frustration, adjusting his approach. When a design choice proved effective, he did not linger on satisfaction. He moved forward. There was no evidence of isolation for its own sake. The man did not write of society as an enemy, nor of escape as a victory. His language remained neutral, analytical. Yet it was clear that his choice to live here was intentional, sustained by conviction rather than necessity. Eleanor closed the notebook and opened another. This one shifted focus slightly. The entries addressed broader considerations: environmental impact, the ethics of presence in a fragile ecosystem, reflections on visibility, not as a metaphor, but as a practical concern. He wrote about how structures altered behavior simply by being seen, how attention invited interference, how minimizing impact required more than restraint. It required withdrawal. Eleanor leaned back in the chair she had not realized she had taken until that moment. The house, she understood now, was not an act of defiance. It was an act of refusal, quiet and precise. A refusal to participate in systems that demanded scale, visibility, permanence. She turned another page. There were entries that hinted at a life beyond the mountain, but they were sparse. Occasional mentions of correspondence, of visits to towns at lower elevations, of transactions conducted efficiently and without attachment. He did not dwell on relationships. When people appeared in his writing, they did so briefly, contextually, as variables rather than anchors. Eleanor wondered about that, whether it was a mission or intention, whether intimacy had been sacrificed or simply redirected. She reached the final pages of the notebook. The entries grew less frequent, more spaced out. The tone remained steady, but the content shifted again. Notes about physical limitations appeared, small acknowledgments of fatigue that did not resolve with rest, observations about how the body responded differently to altitude over time. Eleanor closed the notebook slowly. The man had not disappeared abruptly. His absence, whatever its cause, had been anticipated, prepared for. She stood and moved to the bed built into the wall. Beneath it, drawers were set, flush with the structure. She hesitated, then opened one. Inside, folded carefully, were additional notebooks, sealed in protective covers. Alongside them lay documents wrapped in oiled cloth. Eleanor did not open these yet. Their presence alone told her something important. The house was not merely a dwelling. It was a repository. She straightened, feeling the weight of that realization settle. The layers of fur and hide outside were no longer simply insulation or camouflage. They were part of a broader strategy of preservation. Temperature, humidity, visibility. Everything here had been considered. Eleanor returned to the table and gathered the notebooks she had already examined, stacking them neatly. She did not feel the impulse to scatter, to search frantically for answers. The man behind this house had not hidden information in fragments. He had organized it deliberately, trusting that anyone capable of understanding it would take the time required. She thought again of the way she had approached the house, of how easily she might have dismissed it as an anomaly, a curiosity without context. The man who built it had anticipated that response as well. He had not relied on secrecy alone. He had relied on perception, or the lack of it. The house, Eleanor realized, was not an end point. It was a means, a way to sustain a particular way of thinking, to give it space and time to develop without interference. She felt a subtle shift in herself as she stood there, surrounded by evidence of another person's sustained attention. The calm she had felt upon entering deepened, becoming something more complex. Respect, certainly, but also responsibility. Whoever this man had been, whatever had led him to leave this place, he had not done so carelessly. He had not erased himself. He had arranged his presence in such a way that it could be understood, but only by someone willing to proceed without haste. Eleanor looked once more around the room. The silence no longer felt neutral. It felt expectant, not of action, but of comprehension. She understood now that the house was not meant to be discovered by many. was meant to be encountered by one at the right moment, under the right conditions, not to be claimed, not to be exploited, but to be read. And as she stood there, the notebooks resting on the table, the mountain pressing quietly against the walls, Eleanor knew that she was no longer simply uncovering the story of a man who had chosen to live differently. She was being asked, without words, to consider what it meant to do the same. Eleanor did not open the wrapped documents immediately. After the slow accumulation of understanding that had filled the room, the impulse to rush toward a conclusion felt almost violent. She resisted it, standing instead at the center of the house, allowing the meaning of what she had already learned to settle into place. The house, she now understood, had never been neutral. Every choice made in its construction had served more than comfort or shelter. The exterior layers of hide and fur were not simply insulation or camouflage. They were part of a broader, disciplined system. They regulated temperature with a precision that modern materials often failed to achieve. They controlled moisture without sealing the structure into stagnation. They softened sound, absorbed light, and blurred edges. They created a stable internal environment not only for a person, but for preservation. The thought changed how Eleanor saw the drawers beneath the bed, the sealed notebooks, the careful absence of anything that might degrade quickly. This place had been designed to hold something intact over time. She sat down at the table again, more slowly now, as though her body had learned a different pace from the house itself. The chair felt familiar beneath her, shaped by repeated use. She placed her hands flat on the surface and waited, not for courage, but for clarity. When she reached for the oiled cloth, she did so deliberately. The fabric unfolded without resistance, releasing a faint scent that reminded her of old workshops and preserved tools. Inside lay a stack of documents, their edges aligned, their surfaces protected. They were not fragile in the way ancient paper was fragile, but they had been treated with care that assumed time, not urgency. Eleanor lifted the first sheet. It was not what she expected. There were no dramatic confessions, no declarations of intent, no personal letters addressed to an unknown reader. Instead, the document was formal, precise, written in the language of contracts and assessments. Dates, locations, signatures. It took her a moment to recognize the significance of what she was reading, and another to understand its implications. The papers detailed land use agreements that had never been finalized, environmental impact assessments that had been commissioned but quietly withdrawn, reports that contradicted publicly released findings. As Eleanor read, her professional instincts sharpened. She recognized the structure of the documents immediately. These were not drafts. They were completed analyses, suppressed rather than disproven. She moved to the next page, then the next. The pattern became unmistakable. Over several years, studies had been conducted in this region, not by independent researchers, but by contractors working under strict confidentiality. The findings consistently pointed to long-term environmental damage that would result from proposed developments. Water contamination, soil instability, irreversible changes to alpine ecosystems. Yet none of these conclusions had reached public records. Eleanor felt a tightening in her chest, not shock, but a grim recognition. She had seen this before, though never so comprehensively documented. The difference here was scale and intent. These documents were not fragments salvaged from negligence. They were evidence collected deliberately, preserved systematically. She turned another page. Interspersed among the formal reports were handwritten annotations in the same precise script she had encountered in the notebooks. The man had not altered the findings. He had contextualized them, cross-referenced data with his own observations, marked inconsistencies between field conditions and official summaries, noted where language had been softened, where risk had been reframed as uncertainty. Eleanor leaned back, exhaling slowly. The house had not been built merely to escape scrutiny. It had been built to withstand it. She understood now why visibility had been such a recurring concern in the notebooks. This was not about privacy alone. It was about protection, about ensuring that what had been gathered here could not be easily seized, dismissed, or destroyed. She reached for another bundle of documents, this one thinner, bound with twine. Inside were maps, more detailed than those she had seen earlier. They traced proposed access roads, extraction sites, staging areas. Overlaid on them were the man's own markings, identifying areas of cultural significance, fragile habitats, water sources that did not appear in official surveys. Eleanor recognized some of the locations immediately. They overlapped with regions she herself had studied in other contexts, places where data had always seemed incomplete, oddly sanitized. A realization began to form, slow but relentless. This man had not come here to live apart from the world. He had come here to observe it from a position that made interference difficult. The mountain was not a refuge, it was a vantage point. She returned her attention to the documents, reading more carefully now. Dates aligned with public hearings that had produced no objections. Reports matched timelines of projects approved without delay. The omissions were no longer abstract. They were traceable, intentional. Eleanor felt the weight of the house around her then, not as shelter, but as a vessel. The layered walls, the controlled environment, the careful maintenance. Everything had been arranged to allow these materials to survive long enough to matter. She closed her eyes briefly, steadying herself. Her role in this story shifted again, becoming sharper, more defined. She was no longer simply a reader of someone else's work. She was a witness. The question of what to do with this knowledge arose naturally, but Eleanor did not attempt to answer it yet. She understood that haste would be a betrayal of the very discipline that had brought these documents into existence. The man who built this house had not acted impulsively. He had committed to patience, to longevity. She gathered the documents and returned them carefully to their place beneath the bed. Not out of secrecy, but out of respect. Their meaning did not diminish when they were unseen. If anything, it intensified. Standing again, Eleanor moved toward the wall where the notebooks were stored. She selected one she had not yet opened and leafed through it briefly. The later entries confirmed what the documents implied. The man had anticipated discovery, but not by institutions. He wrote about probability, about the likelihood that the house would eventually be found by someone capable of understanding both its construction and its contents. He did not write of justice or exposure in grand terms. He wrote of continuity, of ensuring that information remained intact long enough to intersect with the right moment, the right reader. Eleanor closed the notebook, feeling the resonance of that idea settle within her. She was acutely aware now of the tension embedded in the house itself. The walls did not simply protect, they concealed. The fur did not merely insulate, it disguised. These choices carried ethical weight. They balanced on a narrow line between preservation and complicity. If she took the documents with her, she would make them visible. She would expose them to scrutiny, but also to distortion, legal obstruction, delay. If she left them here, she would preserve their integrity, but risk their irrelevance. Eleanor walked slowly to the door and rested her hand against it, feeling the steady resistance of the wood. Beyond it lay the open world, the trail, the systems she knew how to navigate. Inside, behind her, lay evidence that challenged those systems at their foundation. She did not yet decide. Instead, she turned back into the room and looked once more at the house as a whole. It did not offer guidance. It did not instruct. It simply existed, holding its contents with quiet fidelity. Eleanor understood then that the house was not waiting for action, was waiting for judgment, and that judgment could not be made in haste, nor alone. It required time, reflection, and a willingness to accept consequence. The realization did not frighten her. It steadied her. She knew that whatever choice she made would extend beyond herself, just as the man's choice to build this house had extended beyond his own life. The layers of hide and fur, the stone base, the careful orientation. These were not eccentricities. They were commitments. As Eleanor stood there, the documents returned to their place. The silence of the room deepened into something resolute. The house had done what it was built to do. It had preserved truth without forcing it into the light. What remained was not discovery, but responsibility. And that, Eleanor understood, was the heaviest thing the house had been designed to hold. The decision to go felt heavier than the decision to enter had been, not because the act itself was difficult, but because departure implied conclusion. Inside the house, time had lost its usual forward pressure. Moments had stretched, not in emptiness, but in density. Each thought seemed to settle fully before yielding to the next. To step outside was to rejoin a rhythm that no longer matched her own. She moved through the room once more, not searching, not inspecting, but acknowledging. Her hands adjusted the edge of a folded blanket on the built-in bed. She returned a notebook to its precise position on the shelf, aligning it with the others. These gestures were not sentimental. They were corrective, as if she were restoring a balance temporarily disturbed by her presence. At the door, she paused. The light beyond it was still warm, unchanged. The mountain had not shifted. There was no signal, no external marker that anything of significance had occurred within these walls. That absence felt intentional now, almost reassuring. The house did not announce transitions. It absorbed them. Eleanor stepped outside and closed the door behind her, pressing it gently until it settled into place. The muted interior quiet gave way to the open silence of the mountains, broader and less contained. The air felt different on her skin, though she knew the temperature had not changed. She stood for a moment, listening, allowing her senses to recalibrate. Then she turned back to the house. From the outside, it had already begun to withdraw. The fur-covered walls softened its outline against the slope, dissolving the sharp distinction between structure and terrain. In the light of early afternoon, it looked less like something built than something grown, an extension of the mountain's own logic. Eleanor approached the wall and adjusted a loose edge of hide near the doorframe, tucking it more securely beneath the overlapping layer above. The action felt instinctive, almost expected. The house accepted the correction without resistance, its surface yielding and then settling. She stepped back and took a final, deliberate look. There was no sense of farewell. The house did not invite that kind of closure. Instead, there was a quiet continuity, the impression that nothing essential would be altered by her departure. It would remain as it was, holding its contents, maintaining its internal balance, waiting without anticipation. Eleanor turned and began the descent. The path back to the trail was easy to find. The terrain offered no resistance, as though the mountain itself approved of her return to familiar routes. Yet with each step downward, she felt the subtle dissonance between where she had been and where she was going. The openness of the landscape now felt exposed rather than liberating. The marked trail, once reassuring, seemed overly defined. She walked steadily, her movements measured, her mind active but not unsettled. The documents beneath the bed, the notebooks on the shelf, the house itself, all of it remained intact behind her, not diminished by her knowledge, but sharpened by it. When she reached the main trail, she stopped briefly, looking back once more. From this distance, the house was no longer visible. It had vanished entirely, reclaimed by angle and texture. Eleanor knew exactly where it stood, yet her eyes could not locate it. She resumed walking. As the hours passed and the elevation dropped, familiar concerns began to reassert themselves. The logistics of returning to her work, the expectations attached to her role, the systems she understood how to navigate. But these thoughts no longer dominated. They took their place alongside something quieter, more persistent. She thought of the man who had built the house, not as a figure of isolation or defiance, but as someone who had chosen coherence over participation. Someone who had accepted the cost of being unseen in order to preserve what mattered to him. She did not romanticize the choice. The notebooks had been clear about its difficulty. Physical strain, loneliness, implied if not stated. The discipline required to live without accumulation, without distraction. This had not been an escape. It had been a sustained effort. Eleanor understood now that the house had not changed her in any sudden or dramatic way. There would be no declaration, no immediate shift in her life's trajectory. What it had done was quieter, and therefore more profound. It had altered the scale by which she measured consequence. By the time she reached the lodge, the sun was beginning its slow descent, casting long shadows across the lower slopes. The building felt loud to her now, not in sound, but in presence. People moved through it, voices overlapping, routines unfolding without pause. Eleanor moved among them with ease, answering questions, exchanging brief greetings, yet part of her remained elsewhere. That night, she slept deeply, without dreams. In the days that followed, Eleanor returned to her work. She completed her assessments, filed her reports, met her obligations. Nothing in her outward behavior suggested deviation. Yet beneath the surface, her attention had shifted. She read documents differently now, alert to omissions as much as inclusions. She noticed how language softened impact, how certainty dissolved into acceptable ambiguity. She did not speak of the house, not because she feared consequence, but because she recognized timing. The man's notebooks had emphasized this repeatedly. Truth did not require immediate exposure to retain its force. In fact, premature visibility could weaken it, scattering its meaning across arguments and defenses before it had a chance to settle. Eleanor maintained her connection to the region, returning occasionally under the guise of routine work. Each time, she adjusted her route slightly, ensuring that the house remained untouched, unobserved by others. She never entered it again. There was no need. Its contents did not change, and neither did her understanding of them. Months passed. The world beyond the mountains continued its negotiations, its expansions, its compromises. Projects advanced, others stalled. Reports circulated. Some were challenged, others were quietly revised. Eleanor participated where she could, influencing outcomes not through revelation, but through precision. She inserted questions where certainty had been assumed. She requested clarifications that delayed approvals. She allowed data to speak without forcing it into spectacle. And slowly, imperceptibly, the balance shifted. It was not a victory. There were no announcements, no acknowledgments. But certain developments were postponed. Certain regions were reclassified. The pace of intervention slowed. Eleanor did not attribute these changes solely to her actions. That would have been inaccurate and arrogant. She understood now that influence rarely belonged to a single hand. It accumulated through alignment, through timing, through restraint. The house remained, high above, layered in hide and fur, absorbing wind and light, holding its contents in steady silence. It did not need to be defended. It had been built to endure, not to argue. Sometimes, Eleanor thought of it in moments of uncertainty, not as a retreat, but as a measure. When decisions pressed, when urgency threatened to override judgment. She recalled the discipline embedded in its walls, the patience required to build something that did not seek recognition, the courage to trust that meaning could survive invisibility. She never returned with anyone else. The house did not belong to her, and she did not claim it. Her role had been temporary, precise. She had been allowed to see, and in seeing, to adjust her course. That was enough. Years later, should someone else walk that mountain on a warm, unremarkable day, should they step off the trail for reasons they could not fully articulate, the house would be there. Not waiting, but ready. Holding what it had always held. Not a secret, but a choice, preserved long enough to matter. If this story made you stop and think, don't let it end here. Subscribe to the channel to see the next stories as they're released. Watch our other videos for more stories like this one, and share this video with someone who might feel it the same way you did.